Okay, welcome to Political Science 220 International Politics. My name is Brian Erlacher. I will be talking you through some of the concepts from this class. And we're going to start off in Chapter 1 talking about levels of analysis, which is a really critical concept for organizing international politics more generally. But before we get to that, I want to take a moment quick and talk about theories. Over the course of the semester, we're going to be introducing a variety of different theories, and it's useful to maybe have a sense of what to do with those theories. Levels of analysis will help us with some of that, but I think it's also worth recognizing why we would have a variety of different theories and how to judge a good theory, right? So a good theory should be able to explain a lot of different things, and it's able to do that in a fairly simple way with only a handful of pieces, right? And so rather than thinking about theories as being true or false and looking for the right theory, it's useful instead, I think, to think about theories as being able to do a good job at explaining the world. Is a theory useful or not useful when it comes to making policy decisions, when it comes to making predictions about the future, when it comes to just basically making sense of what's happening in the world and what's happening in the news. So I think that's useful to have in mind that theories are judged on what they can do for us. But I think it's also useful to keep in mind that all theories are lies. You might have heard, oh, in political science, all theories are lies. No, in all of science, theories are lies. Because what they do is they take an incredibly complicated world, and the world is incredibly complicated, and they pare away all the stuff that we don't think we need to be able to make good sense of that world, and we present a version of the world that is so simplified as to be almost ridiculous, but is hopefully useful. Hopefully we've left behind the bare bones structure of what we need to be able to make sense of that world. But in doing so, we've really grossly distorted what the world looks like in a way that is a lie. This is not just something that we do in the social sciences. It happens in all of the sciences as well. And so if you take first semester physics, you'll learn an equation for gravity that things fall at the rate of 9.8 meters per second and accelerate at that rate as gravity acts on them. And you can work out the equation in simple algebra. And it's pretty straightforward and intuitive, and you can test it by dropping things. And then you come back into second semester physics, and all of a sudden the math got really complicated, and they're talking about gravity behaving in ways that doesn't look like what you've seen before. And what's happened is that, and they don't tell you this, but what's happened is that first semester physics is based in Newtonian understandings of gravity. Second semester physics is going to be based in more Einsteinian understandings of gravity and relativity, where things get all messy and murky and the math gets complicated. Right? What they're not telling you is that those two understandings of gravity are completely incompatible. They can't be made to operate the same. Is one of them right and one of them wrong? No. In fact, they're probably both wrong. If you continue on into graduate level physics, you might be taken into the secret room with the chalkboards full of equations, and they leave you there, and you come back a couple hours later and say, is it true? And they say, oh, we don't really know, but the math does suggest that maybe gravity doesn't even exist at all. Obviously, we're not going to tell the undergrads that, because that would create all sorts of chaos. They need to know that Newtonian physics works this way and Einsteinian physics works this way. But once we push out beyond the boundaries of what we understand, we really don't know. But what we do know is if you want to calculate how fast something is falling on Earth, you use Newton's equation. It's really useful. And if you want to understand the red shift that occurs in light as it travels across the galaxy and is acted upon by the gravity forces of stars, if you want to know that, you need Einstein's equations, and you can't understand the behavior of light or the behavior of things at high speeds without that. So for some problems, Einstein's very useful. For other problems, Newton's is very useful. And that's why we continue to teach both. Right? So theories are judged not on whether they're true or false, but whether they're useful or not useful. Right. Important idea. Secondly, theories in political science, particularly international relations, are terribly named. We have two theories that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about: realism and liberal theory or liberalism. Both are poorly named, I think, lead folks off in a direction that's maybe not the right way to go. So with realism, you might think, oh, this is sort of realistic or clear-eyed and hard-nosed. It's not. Realism is a theory. It's taken a complicated world. It's simplified it down. It's not necessarily more realistic than any other perspective. In fact, realism refers back to a fad in scientific philosophy back at the end of World War II that fell out of favor pretty quickly, that said that our theories were true and that when we changed our theories, the nature of reality changed along with it, which I think folks generally sort of pushed aside and said, maybe that's not how things actually work. So realism is just named after that. It's not named because it's the correct theory, the realistic theory. Liberal theory also has connotations I don't know are necessarily appropriate. If you've heard liberal before, you've probably heard in the context of American politics as Democrat or leftist, and that's not the context we're using here. In fact, most foreign policy Republicans, or most Republicans, ascribe to liberal theory in their foreign policy approach. Most Democrats tend to subscribe to liberal theory in their foreign policy approach. It's the leading paradigm for American politicians. But I think it's useful to understand the three different ways liberal gets used, right? So there's the contemporary political usage, leftist, Democrat. You probably are familiar with that one. The second usage relates back to the Age of Enlightenment, and we might call that classical liberal, right? This is the ideas of the Enlightenment, that human beings were able to understand the world with reason, that the world operates according to laws, that those laws can be found in science, those laws can be found in economics. And so you have Adam Smith arguing that the invisible hand will use competition to move resources around in the way that's most efficient. We can see that in the writings of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, where they talk about these inalienable rights of human beings, where they talk about how you can structure political systems to behave in certain ways. All of this is rooted in this idea that human beings can understand a natural world that behaves in regular, predictable ways, right? So that's a classical understanding of liberal. The way that we're going to use liberal in this class is, I think, maybe best described as foreign policy liberalism, which relates to ideas that were initially introduced by Immanuel Kant in the 19th century and then picked up by Woodrow Wilson in the 20th century as part of his plan to end World War I and remake the international system. He had a series of ideas about how that system would operate and could operate better, and that formed the sort of kernel for liberal theory. It's a foreign policy approach with a set of ideas attached to it. And those ideas have been ascribed to by Democrats and Republicans over the course of the 20th century. Okay, so with that as a foundation, now we can shift to talking about this idea of levels of analysis. This is something that is talked about in Goldstein and Peevehouse, and I think it's useful to have a sort of a background. At first glance, it might not seem particularly useful, but if you think about this course as part of a broader sequence of courses that are going to tackle different theories of international relations at different levels, maybe that's a more useful way of thinking about things. But I think the best way to wrap your head around this is to sort of shift away from international politics to something maybe we know a little bit more about, maybe meteorology. So as I understand it, there's a couple different ways you can be a meteorologist. Some meteorologists are interested in studying climate, right? Is the Earth warming or cooling? What's happening with that? And if that's the kind of meteorologist you are, you need information related to average global temperature, maybe the average temperature of the oceans. Maybe you need to know the volume of sea ice that's packed in on the poles. Maybe those are things that are useful for you, and you would track over time, and you would be able to say, I see climate change. Most meteorologists don't do that. Most meteorologists earn their money telling people, is it going to rain tomorrow? And if that's the kind of meteorologist you are, and I come to you and say, did you know how much sea ice there is, in the North Pole? You would say, no, I don't, and I don't care, and that's not useful to me, because in order for me to make the predictions that I need to make, I need to know things like temperature in my area, barometric pressure, humidity. Maybe I need to get out the radar and look at cloud cover, and that will be able to tell me whether or not it's going to rain. So you're looking at different things. Some meteorologists are interested in why tornadoes form or how tornadoes operate. And again, knowing very little about meteorology beyond what I've observed from that movie Twister, maybe what you need to do is you need to get sensors in the path of a tornado, and the sensors can get picked up and swirl around with the tornado, and then you can map its movement and see how it behaves. And that's a completely different set of information, and that has almost no overlap with what a meteorologist who's interested in climate change would want to know, right? You could show them that data, they might say, oh, that's interesting, but it's not useful for me in any way, shape, or form. So if we're thinking about theories in terms of being useful, we have to recognize that the kinds of questions we're interested in are going to determine what kind of data and what kind of theories are going to be useful to answer those questions. And the same is true in international relations when we study international politics, right? Some questions are really big, right? Is the system trending toward peacefulness? war appears to be on the decline. Is that going to continue, or is it just sort of a lull and we're going to see a return to more frequent interstate war? This is a big picture question, and folks are debating with questions like, the casualty counts in war, or the volume of global trade, or the time it takes to travel across the oceans. And those are sort of the indicators people will use to answer that question. Most people aren't interested in those big picture questions. They're maybe interested in relations between two countries, the United States and South Korea, for example. And if that's what you're interested in, maybe you want to look at treaties and agreements between those two countries, trade, diplomatic ties, study abroad. Those kind of things might help you make sense of what that relationship looks like. Some folks who study international politics are interested in sort of the domestic forces, right? That shape how decisions get made and why this treaty gets ratified or doesn't get ratified. And so maybe you need to look at Congress, maybe you need to look at legislative districts, maybe you need to look at interest groups or the media or public opinion, all of these domestic level factors that can shape policy for states. Or maybe we're interested in why one decision was made in a particular way and not in another way. And if that's what we're interested in, maybe we need to understand the leader or the group of people around that leader. We would look at the individual level of analysis, and that would involve things like, how does the leader think about the world? What information does he or she have? What is the personality or the character of that person? How does the group around the leader operate? And do they process information well, or are they hostile to each other? What does that dynamic look like? And that would be different kinds of information that would be very useful for that specific question, but wouldn't be useful for answering the question, is war on the decline in general in the international system? So levels of analysis is just a starting point for us to think about theories and questions and how we apply and approach them. In this class, we're going to be spending most of our time talking about theories and questions that relates to the global level and the interstate level. I have a follow-up course on foreign policy, which focuses much more on the domestic level and the individual level of analysis.